Hi, I'm Steve Morgan and I'm stood here outside the Pierhead building down at Cardiff Bay. And I just thought I'd spend a minute or two reflecting with you why I use the phrase working with risk so often in my work. The main reason is a challenge to the misuse, I would say, of the term risk assessment. Working with risk is something I've used for many years, but it became the name of the publications, the Trainer's Manual and the Practitioner's Manual back in 2007. And that was to reflect a whole range of content that included identifying risks, managing risks, taking risks, communicating and indeed documenting risks. But if I just go back for a minute or two just to think about that phrase risk assessment, even in the last video I emphasised how I felt it was overused. In health and social care services you'll be well aware, no doubt, of questions like where's the risk assessment? Have you done the risk assessment? Make sure your risk assessment is completed. And adopting such phrases with such grim regularity almost gives the sense that risk assessment is the end in itself, whereas, as I previously stated, it is an extremely important and valuable means towards an end. It's the vitally important documentation or accumulation of information that helps us to document those clearly made decisions or judgments. So because as a practitioner you're involved day in, day out with identifying risks, analysing and assessing that information, managing the risks, managing crises, taking risks, communicating and documenting risks, then instead of using the generic phrase risk assessment so often, I would prefer us to use the phrase working with risk, because that's pretty much what we're doing day in, day out. If you're a senior manager, you'll be involved in developing risk policies, procedures, protocols, involved in inquiries, making judgments and decisions at higher levels within organisations, all of which will involve degrees of risk. So indeed what you're doing is working with risk. So I see this as a much more important generic statement. It's not just semantics, though those of you looking at a number of these different videos will know that a common theme is use of language. Use of language vitally important, because if we're communicating with other people, we need to be clear in what we're saying, because we can easily fall into an assumption that those receiving the information are interpreting it exactly the same way as we intend, whereas there can be many different interpretations of these general statements. Now, clearly I'm talking about working with risk as being a generic phrase. I would always prefer people to be very much more specific in the statements of what you're doing, what you're talking about, what you're communicating. Be very clear when you're making a risk assessment, stated that's what it is, and that this is the information on which you can then base the more detailed judgments, the decisions. So working with risk is that call. If we are being generic in our language, then it's a challenge to misusing and overusing the phrase risk assessment. Having said that, as a final practical tip on this particular video, I just want to offer this thought when you are undertaking a risk assessment. Something that you'll find as an essential component in tools that I've devised, that I've had published, but doesn't appear anywhere else. And I really think it should be a crucial element of all risk tools. And that's the prompt for you to make a note, state what the sources of information are that's available to you when you make your decision, when you make your judgments, when you're making your assessment, your statement of assessment. Now I say that primarily because we're not always accessing all of the information. In fact, I would go as far as saying you probably never have 100% access to all the information. So you're dealing with incomplete information a lot of the time. But I'd also go as far as saying that the way the loose use and interpretation of language happens over time, the way things are recorded and become statements of law almost, that you're also dealing with inaccurate information from time to time. So another important communication that you should be making when you're noting your assessment of risk is to say what the source of information are that's based on. For example, it might well just be a one-to-one conversation with a client, but it may well be that you're involved with somebody over many years and you have access to a whole range of historical information and different sources of information. So these kind of statements communicate important information to others, and that will certainly underpin good positive risk taking. So on that note, let me just finish off by reminding you this isn't about positive risk, this is about the importance in our use of language. So take risks for positive outcomes.